A night of violence in northern Iowa has left 2 convenience store clerks dead in 2 separate shootings. A teenage gunman is accused of murdering a clerk in Algona and then heading south to gun down another clerk in Humboldt.
I'm always curious, how did it feel when you pulled the trigger?
It had no effect on me. I just didn't even care. I just felt like my adrenaline was pumping and I felt good.
Did you ever give any thought to maybe calling 911?
No. Yeah, I thought, well, they're probably dead.
Why did you want her to be dead as opposed to just be injured?
I don't know, like, if I was just gonna shoot to injure her, why would I shoot her at all?
Open up your door. Go ahead and step out. Come back here, will you? I'm gonna keep seeing your hands, okay? Put your hands up. Come on out. Okay, I'm gonna ask you, is there anything in your pocket? Don't hurt me, folks. Please take me anyway.
Can you tell me what happened tonight?
I think I was watching The Hangover or something. And then I packed up a jacket and a sleeping bag and stuff. And then I took the car.
What time did you take the car? What time did you leave the house?
It was probably about midnight. I drove to our cabin.
Was it your parents' cabin?
I don't know, it's like my entire family's cabin.
Why'd you go up there?
I don't know, I just needed somewhere to go. Like, I don't know, I just got in the car, I didn't really know where to go. And so like, I thought I could go up there, I'd be the only one up there. Well, usually it was unlocked, and I got up there, and it was locked. I broke a window.
He has a complete disregard for supervision, for sanctions, for the legal and criminal system. And that's what we see with very criminally oriented people. It's also what we sometimes see with very, very impulsive people.
And what'd you do there?
Everybody's deer hunting and stuff was up there. It's like I seen a rifle and then like some case. I looked in the case and that's where I found the gun.
Okay.
The pistol.
Why were you taking all that stuff, Michael?
I don't know why I took the pistol. I was kind of fascinated by guns.
And then what happened?
I knew I was going to get locked up again because I violated my probation. So I got in a car, I had a gun, and I started driving south. I ended up in Iowa.
I don't believe a statement like, I don't know why I took the pistol. I think that his acquisition of guns and leaving was just going to be to extend what he'd already been fantasizing about. He needs to be powerful.
Psychopathic youths, the literature shows that they are more likely to be carrying specifically firearms than, say, a roll of nickels or a knife or some other type of weapon. Wanting to carry one, despite knowing you're essentially a fugitive from the law, and knowing that it carries really significant consequences with it, it's just very consistent with psychopathy.
I was driving, and I just keep looking out the window. Because I hadn't slept for a while, and I started to hallucinate. I fell asleep a couple times while I was driving.
It all started in Algona, Iowa. Pretty heartbreaking story and unbelievable.
Investigators say a man wearing a ski mask walked into the store and demanded Bowman Hall put cash and cigarettes into a duffel bag. She did, and he shot her.
Can you tell me what you did there?
I had no money, so I was trying to get some money. I was outside and I felt
in there? Tell me exactly what you did.
I can show you, kind of, like, I had the mask on, I had the gun in the bag. Like, I walked in, I put the bag on the counter, and I was pointing the gun, and I was like, put the woman and the register in the bag.
Okay, and the clerk was standing here like this?
Yeah, and I was just pointing the gun at her, and she put it in there. I was like, get a carton of cigarettes, put it in there. And then she said something.
What did she say?
No, she was like, what type of gun is that? I think she thought it was fake. And I was like, it's a Beretta, and I shot her.
She thought the gun was fake. She's challenged his power, and he shoots her. In his case, going for power is the way he is going to express his psychopathy.
By standing up and reenacting, I think he's showing off. I think he's proud of what he's done, and he wants to show someone what he has done. Swanson is really showing us all the markers of psychopathic behavior.
It certainly occurred to me that there was some potential relishing of the memory when he asked the detective to stand up so he could act out what he had done. Then they sit back down and he describes shooting the store clerk in a really high level of detail. Having evaluated people who've shot and killed other people, that level of detail is not always there.
How many times did you shoot?
One time.
One time? And what happened to her?
I hit her in the face, and she fell, and she smacked her head on the desk. I saw where the bullet hit her. I think it was like right here. And like I saw it looked like a little cigarette burn. But I don't know, I think that's because, like, I don't know, that's where the bullet went in, I don't know.
Why'd you shoot her?
I was just thinking, like, well, the police are gonna get called eventually. But if I shoot her, it's not gonna happen right away. And then I walked out.
Do you think she was dead?
I assumed she was.
Swanson doesn't have any real emotion. He's not upset or bothered by the fact that he took another human being's life. He is impulsive, he is detached. There's just no emotion.
So as you left the parking lot there counting the money, then what were you gonna do?
I got like $800-some. Oh, I was just like, damn. I ran out a lot of money really fast. I could probably do it again.
You looks like you're 17 years old?
Yep.
Going on 18?
Getting there.
When he was 17 years old, in 2010, just about a month before he committed these murders, he was evaluated. Michael was having some sexual and violent themes, and there was some concern that he had, and the staff had, about him being impulsive. Another excerpt says, "I am concerned that he poses a risk to society if unmedicated, and even if medicated, he is still somewhat unpredictable." That is a very strong conclusion. If I'm reading this report and I'm Swanson's family, I'm scared. This evaluation is absolutely a warning sign.
You jumped out of school?
Well, I got expelled in junior high.
How come you got expelled?
I did acid and I went to school. I took my pants off in class.
How come you took your pants off? Just to kind of screw around?
I don't know. I was just high as hell, and it seemed like a good idea at the time.
His anecdote about being high as a kite means that he was using enough to be completely disinhibited in a public space to take his clothes off. He has all the characteristic features that should alarm us.
I think it's partly because it's antisocial, so it goes against societal norms, so there's an attraction there. But I also think it actually gives them the sensation that they have a hard time feeling otherwise. It takes a lot more for them to experience excitement and to experience a high, and if drug and alcohol use gives them that, it's thrill-seeking. He's trying drug use, he's trying sexually acting out, trying anything to see what gives him the best high.
I was doing a lot of stuff though, like pretty much everything. Like, I was doing ecstasy and mushrooms. I was like popping some other pills. I've done drugs for a long time.
Oh, yeah. Since how old?
Since I was like 12.
Really? You ever get any treatment, or anybody ever give you some help for it?
I was locked up at the hospital like 4 times, and then like I had to do some outpatient stuff.
That's some tough stuff to beat, isn't it?
Well, I don't know. I never really tried to beat it, so.
Okay.
Swanson has this pattern of drug and alcohol use and is willing to try anything and everything. Thrill-seeking behavior is one of those markers we look for in psychopathic behavior and in trying to diagnose psychopathy.
There is a relationship between impulse control and drug use, and there is a relationship between impulse control and psychopathy. People with psychopathy tend to use drugs more. I think that's similar to what we're seeing here with Michael Swanson.
I was driving for like 45 minutes, and I just went south and ended up in a different town. And I was driving by a gas station, and I noticed there's only one person in it again, so I figured I could do it again.
So did you just pull into the parking lot?
Yeah, I just pulled like, you want me to drive?
When you came in here and you saw that she was the only one there, and then you parked on this side, did you sit there for a while, or did you get out right away?
So before I went in the second one, I chambered her out.
Okay.
This time, though, I knew I was going to shoot her.
25 miles south, a similar scene. 61-year-old Sheila Myers was shot and killed while working behind the counter at the Come and Go in Humboldt. She's been a clerk at the store for 13 years.
Even if she cooperated, you knew you were going to do that? Why did you make up your mind that way?
I just felt like it'd be easier.
Easier? In terms of what?
Regardless of what happens, she's not there. So it'd just be like easier to deal with.
The fact that it's an hour between the first and the second kill is behavior that absolutely is becoming compulsive. And when you add in an emerging compulsivity with the fact that he's had impulse control problems his entire life, and he's a drug and alcohol abuser who is seeking that high, and in the process of upping that ante, we've now gotten to a place where he's murdered someone, and he liked the high. He liked the thrill, and he needs it again.
When I got out, I put the mask on, I put the coat on, I put the gun in the bag like I did the other time.
Okay.
Then I walked in with the gun in the bag, and I took it out, and I pointed it at her. I put the bag on the table. That's what I did. Like, I don't remember what I said, but she put the money in the bag. The gun was like a foot from her head.
And where did you shoot this girl?
In the face.
Why the face? Did you do that on purpose?
Well, I don't know. It just seems like it's final. She made some noise, and she just fell down. I remember that first one, cause like she hit her face like that, and I don't know, I started laughing.
He thinks it's just kind of funny, like watching a comedy show where someone bangs their head on something. He has a complete lack of empathy about another human being. They are just objects. That indifference is just the hallmark of psychopathy. And it's pretty disturbing, as he's not that old.
I remember, she said something.
Okay.
Made some type of noise.
Okay. What type of noise did she make?
Half scream, half gasp.
Can you imitate it?
I don't know, it just kind of sounded like she's surprised. It's like, oh. I don't know.
He's jovial, he's laughing. I think that really taps into the high that he experienced. And also maybe some budding sadistic tendencies. This enjoyment that Swanson's showing us is highly consistent with psychopathic behavior.
What did you feel when you pulled the trigger?
I felt powerful, but like, I don't know, I just didn't really care about them.
How do you feel now? Do you feel the same, or has it changed a little bit?
Not really.
Not really?
I don't know. I just feel like, I don't know, sometimes people get shot.
I'm going to tell you, both the clerks who shot did die tonight. Neither one made it.
So, like, why didn't you get transferred, like, to the Hennepin County JDC and then, like, go to court and all that?
You're probably going to have to deal with some things here in Iowa. It won't necessarily be up in Minnesota.
I was thinking probably, like, get transferred.
He's 150% focused on his own well-being, how he's going to be essentially inconvenienced by his crime, and where he's going to be sent. This is classic to psychopaths. They don't care about others. It's 100% about him.
I bet the courts I want to do like a psych eval or something, I don't know.
Why do you say that?
Most people, if they shot somebody, they feel something.
Do you feel bad that you don't feel bad? Or still indifferent?
I don't know. But I think it's just because I know. I'm trying to turn the state.
Soldiers who've shot enemy combatants still feel something after that. He's not talking about an enemy combatant that he killed in the line of duty. He's talking about somebody across 1 or 2 state lines. This is so impulsive. This is so pleasure-seeking. It must be mania.
Swanson is not being straight with himself. He's not being, I think, honest. I don't actually think it is complicated. He doesn't feel bad because he's a psychopath. It is really that simple.
Hey, man, I'm hell, man. Damn, bro, how are you holding up? Man, I ain't get. I'm straight, man. I'm just bored as hell.
I couldn't believe it, bro. It's crazy.
At the 40.
Oh, you had a 40 cal?
Hell yeah.
Damn! Toting the heavy artillery. What do you mean?
Hell yeah. You should have seen, though. That's crazy.
Damn, bro. How did it feel, bro?
I went in there, and I had the gun, and I had the bag, and I started the camera. Not like, man, put in the bag. And I shot the in the face. I got just walked out like it went. It's crazy. It felt good, though.
Swanson's an entirely different person with different tone, different speech pattern, the pace with which he's talking. He's alive, he's animated, he's experiencing what feels like a high.
There is a status element in his mind. He's bragging about what he's done, and he's acknowledging felt good. So these features of the mimicry, the thrill, the lack of remorse, enjoying it and bragging about it, those are significant features of psychopathy.
The prosecution says Michael Swanson did this in part for the attention he got from it. The defense says he's insane and doesn't know right from wrong. The state then called a psychiatrist who interviewed Swanson after the crimes. He says Swanson told him he'd been planning to kill since he was 13.
He said, "I have always been fascinated by death and violence. And it was something that I wanted to do. Murder, rape, and cannibalism."
Swanson's mother broke down when the doctor said this.
His original plan was to kill his parents. Those were the first two people he wanted to kill. He's fully capable of deliberating, premeditating, and forming the specific intent to kill.
Verdict number one, we find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree.
Even after a jury convicted Michael Swanson, he smiled.
Mr. Swanson, how do you feel about the verdict?
I'm good. Earlier in the day, Swanson added 2 obscene gestures to that ever-present smile.
Please, ma'am, it's a murder, ma'am. It's a murder, ma'am. Please come.
What's happening? So what exactly is happening there?
Ma'am, I tried to get in my sister's apartment all night last night, and nobody would answer. When we came this morning, the door was open, and she was in here dead.
I just started beating on it then with my hands and with the weapon I had. And I had voices talking in my head the whole time. I'm supposed to be in the NBA. I'm supposed to be in the NFL. I could have been Michael Jordan or somebody.
What do you want? I'm not going to say more than that. Hey! Get from behind me!
I knew what y'all did. I know what y'all did.
Get out of there!
No, I know what y'all did.
What are you talking about?
Hey, partner, what's going on? Step on out there. Y'all know what y'all did to me, man.
Hey, step on out there. Come out. Just step out. Open the door.
I'll be fine if I come out.
Yes, yeah, you'll be fine. Open the door. Come out here.
From a behavioral standpoint, he's appearing like someone who's lost in his head and perhaps responding to delusional elements that we can't see or hear.
There's certainly a flavor of paranoia. He's making comments like, "I know what you all have done to me," but it's unclear what he's really referring to. It's possible that this is all part of a ploy, that he wants to present himself as someone who's mentally ill.
How long have you had the current apartment together?
A few months.
Okay, so was it just you, the two of you and your daughter?
Right, and her brother.
Okay. Let's start off with last night. You were with Remy last night?
For a little while. Well, until the incident happened.
Will you be more specific as far as what the incident is?
I just didn't want to be arguing with her about the voices that I was hearing in my head, because I kept telling her, I'm not a failure, I'm not a failure, I'm not a failure, you know, and I wanted to prove it to her. I started hearing these voices in both of my ears, back to back.
Does he have a real mental illness, or is this part of an act? If someone is having a psychotic episode, they may not be in full control of their actions.
The phenomenon of hearing voices or having auditory hallucinations usually is something we consider in the world of the domain of schizophrenia. But most individuals who have voices don't volunteer that they're hearing them. You usually have to ask about them. That definitely raises a red flag for me when he volunteers them like that.
What incident are you talking about that happened until the incident happened?
I ain't like the trick that they put on me.
Someone played a trick on you?
Yeah.
Who was that?
I believe it was her and her brother. They put some kind of voodoo tricks on me. And I had voices talking in my head the whole time. My mind was all messed up. It was all messed up.
What were you hearing?
All kinds of things. All kinds of things. All kinds of things. Her and her brother did it. They Haitians.
If this is more psychopathy, less psychosis, this is the ultimate manipulation attempt, because he is using intelligence, his knowledge of symptoms of mental health conditions, and acting them out in order to be able to maintain his innocence.
Why stop at I'm hearing voices coming out of both ears when I can add in voodoo? Bynum sounds delusional, but he's trying to figure out, how do I play my cards? He's wanting to commit to feigning psychiatric symptoms, likely for a defense. It's not very compelling.
How did you guys end up going to blows?
I just wanted her to just confess what she did.
And what was her answer?
She just kept saying, what am I talking about? And I'm like, y'all know exactly what y'all did, so just go ahead and just tell me the truth. And she was saying, okay, I'll tell you, your mom did it to you. I'm like, what? Oh, man. I knew she was lying, though. I knew she was lying.
So 24 hours, not even, has passed. If somebody were to be experiencing hallucinations and have kind of delusions of voodoo, they're not going to be, short of being on an acid trip, they're not going to be referencing them 18 to 24 hours later like, this is what I was thinking, this is what was going on, and now I'm kind of back to normal.
He is on track with the conversation. He's responding appropriately to the themes as they change in the conversation. And even though he's saying the voices, he's carrying on a coherent, meaningful conversation with them, and he doesn't exhibit the breakdown in the coherence of his thoughts from one thought to the next. We often call that a loosening of association or fragmented thinking that we do see in people who are hallucinating or have schizophrenia. So he appears to be putting on a show of suffering from hearing voices, but his presentation is so highly organized, we know he has an intact cognitive mind with which to interact with the world around him.
I just started beating on it then with my hands and with the weapon I had.
The knife?
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that you were stabbing her or slicing her?
Both.
What was running through your mind when this was happening?
Just voices.
In the crime scene photos, it looks like wounds that are inflicted by somebody who's full of rage. It's not once, it's not twice, it's multiple times. The sheer volume and severity of the injuries is really stunning.
He is veering more into the psychopathic realm than the delusional realm. He had significantly mutilated her body. There's a level of rage and intent and deliberation to the act. For me, these all link to narcissistic rage.
You've probably not done this in the past, I'm assuming, right?
Not as much as I have last night.
Okay. So, this was a major event for you.
Oh, yeah. I kept telling myself that I'm supposed to be in the NBA. I'm supposed to be in the NFL.
Did you play in school?
Yeah, I played in school.
Were you a star?
I wasn't the star, but I was a star on the team.
You were a star?
I could have been a star on the team if the ball was in my hand a lot, but the ball wasn't in my hand a lot. So they already had guys that could do that already.
The detective has his number, let me get this guy talking about himself. His own ego will undo his ability to protect himself here. This guy seems very impressed with himself, despite a lack of achievements.
The most insulting thing to the narcissist is actually, in general, the real world. Most people can grow up and adjust, and they're mature. He's rather narcissistic.
He does strike me as somebody who's very angry about not having reached that potential. Perhaps she didn't believe in his grandiose, inflated sense of his abilities.
Oh my goodness, man. I could have been Michael Jordan or somebody.
Yeah, but he's washed up now.
At least Kobe.
At least Kobe? Did you get jealous when she talked about her love of Dwight Howard? Because you wanted to be that one she looked up to, the one she admired?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
She just didn't want to confirm it?
She'd just be like, yeah, I know. Yeah, I know.
So, how did she end up getting up out of the chair?
When I told her, what did she do to me? And why did she do it for? And that's when she stood up and started running her mouth. She's saying that I'm going crazy and what's wrong with you and you need to go to church and pray. And I'm like, nah, it's not about the church because I know I'm supposed to be a star in some major sport.
For people who are psychopaths, fantasy is more important than reality. But his girlfriend is not conforming to his fantasy, and that enrages him because it doesn't fit in his grand picture of himself. And it's not her fault, but in his mind, it is. So for her to say, now you're just talking crazy, would be a trigger to make him angry.
He feels disrespected when she's, quote, running her mouth. Someone who has psychopathic tendencies wants to be in control of the situation, and this perceived loss of control only fuels that rage. Whereas he couldn't do anything about his professional basketball playing, he can have control over this situation, and he did.
In the weeks leading up to the murder, there are numerous text messages back and forth between Bynum and Remy, or with commenting on from a psychiatric standpoint. Remy writes to him, "You know I love you, but things have to improve. You spit in my face. I'm getting tired of that." And Bynum responds, "What is you talking about? One moment you love me, the next moment you want me to leave." And Remy writes back a little bit later, "I thought it would be different." And Bynum responds, "Make a difference then, instead of talking and running your mouth." It is a threat to his narcissism to hear people giving him feedback, and then that moves him into behavior that's psychopathic.
This text indicates a failure of his accepting responsibility. Rather, it's her. Okay, well, then you make a difference. But we don't see any indication that he's actually recognizing that he's a contributor to their relationship problems.
This is another excerpt from a text exchange where Bynum is saying, "The mind games aren't going to work." And Remy responds by saying, "I'm not playing mind games. This is my life. What about you being wrong? Are you ever?" To which Bynum responds, "Sweetheart, God don't like ugly. He knows exactly what's going on and what's going to happen." He is manipulative, and this is the mind game that he's playing. She's going to conform to what he wants, and it's never his fault.
He does, in another text, make a sexual reference about how he could keep her mouth shut using sexually provocative language. And in that instance, it shows his attempt again to control that through sexual means.
In many cases with psychopathy and violence, sex doesn't become a pleasurable, intimate act between two people. It becomes something that's aggressive and violent and done to the other person, either to put them down or shut them up.
So that's why you slit her throat, because she wouldn't stop going off at the mouth?
Yeah, I'm screaming and yelling.
What'd you do after that?
Fired up another cigar, and I just couldn't believe what had happened.
What happened?
I threw my telephone in the toilet.
Why?
I just ain't want to be bothered anymore.
What'd you do with the clothes you were wearing at the time?
The undershorts I kept on. and I had threw some jeans on.
In the majority of cases, if someone's delusional, they continue to act in a way consistent with their delusion. But in his case, we do see behaviors that he's not a delusional mental health case, but instead someone who's thinking clearly, rationally about what he's doing and hiding evidence.
He's aware of the tactical importance, not that he has a mental illness or not, but of the perception that he has a mental illness, that he is symptomatic, and that if he did kill her, that he did it due to a mental illness and it's not his fault.
You guys were arguing, having problems, or what?
It was pretty much arguing and commotion.
What did she fuss at you about?
Trying to treat her the right way and all this kind of stuff. Say positive things.
What type of things do you normally say to her that aren't nice?
Well, it all depends on how much she pissed me off.
What type of things does she say that make you angry?
She'll say things like, I might have to call Lakeside Behavior Center, or she gonna call my mom for me.
Lakeside Behavioral Center, I guess it's some psychiatric center where he received treatment. One, he's introducing more material to say, hey, I want you to think I have a mental illness that's making me not responsible for this. Two, I want you to think that my dead girlfriend also thought I had a mental illness.
So she's not mean, you think she's just trying to get you help, or no? Or does she say it mean-spirited?
No, she doesn't like to hear my opinion.
Okay.
When majority of the time I'm right.
What do you think your daughter would have thought if she would have seen what was happening?
I wouldn't even do that in front of her.
You would have made sure that she didn't see that happen to her mom?
Mm-hmm.
Because that would have been pretty bad for her, huh?
Yes.
I don't believe him when he says, oh, I wouldn't do that with my daughter there. And I say that because I haven't seen any expressions of remorse or consideration for other people's feelings. We don't hear any concern about her future. What will she think of it? How will she react? Who will she live with? This is a lack of remorse that's really commonly seen in psychopathy.
When was the last time you and Remy had sex?
Right after the stabbing.
Did she have a problem with you having sex with her after you stabbed her?
I don't know. She didn't say much as she did.
So this is after she's been stabbed, her throat slit, she's been punched in the face?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So she was probably not even conscious?
Most likely.
Okay. Do you think she was deceased?
Maybe.
Maybe she was dead when you were having sex?
I just want to get the rest of it out of me.
Okay.
The rest of these whatever crap they put on me, I just want to release all of it.
There's a wide range of reasons why people have sex with dead people. He says it's getting the voodoo magic out of him, but in the big picture, it sounds more like psychopathy to me. There's not a sexual satisfaction, there is a power satisfaction from it.
Psychopaths sometimes do engage in sexually deviant behavior. Having sex with a dead body is the ultimate control for him.
Ever been diagnosed with mental illness?
I was taking meds at one point, but not like I was supposed to.
Yeah. So you were able to combat these voices by taking meds?
Well, I wasn't getting the voices like how I was getting them last night.
He's letting her think there's a relationship between the medications and voices. The medications he says he takes are not medications that are used for schizophrenia, the core symptoms of someone hearing voices, being delusional. So this is him creating a story in the mind of the interrogators to manipulate their view of him. Again, something that we see in psychopathy.
He was talking about voodoo and all this kind of magic power crap, and next thing you know, I got it in my head. Everywhere I look, it's like a voice that I remember. I'm like, yo, that's you right there. Yo, that's you right. I'm like, hey, man, I'm going, like, weird. It's weird. I never felt like that.
Do you see things too, or just hear?
Nah, just seeing. Just hearing.
When he said, just seeing, no, just hearing, I thought that slip up was actually significant. He's not speaking from experience, from the experience of having hallucinations. So I think he's thinking on the fly, trying to figure out what to say, and he's not doing a great job. He looks more like a manipulating psychopath. He's trying to manage the interrogation so they think he's crazy, but I don't believe that he is.
He's so callous, and he talks about this as if he's on stage at a comedy show, and talking about how weird this experience is for him. But in fact, he's talking about the murder of his girlfriend.
Mom, listen.
All right.
Do you remember when I had got expelled from high school?
Okay, first of all, let me tell you something. You the one that went up against that boy.
No, I didn't. We pulled that knife out.
No. I'm talking before that. That's why he brought the knife to you.
Man, please.
He was bullying him.
Whatever. If I would have stayed there, I would be, you already know, I had a talent level that was out of control.
Yeah, but your talent compared to your attitude are two different things. You always had that temper. Then you want to run your mouth.
I'm glad I'm hearing it from you because that's where I got it from.
He's created this fantasy that he could have been, would have been, should have been this professional athlete, and is upset and angered that nobody seems to really realize that about him. And I think Mom really puts him in his place by saying, maybe you did have good skill, but your attitude far exceeded what your skill level was.
We certainly have a hint that he was a bully. That behavior is commonly seen in people who go on to become psychopaths.
I just wanted things to be so different.
Yeah, I understand.
I knew it.
What'd you know?
That I was a star.
Yeah.
Everyone knew it.
On the morning of March 24th, 1998, West Side Middle School, located just outside Jonesboro in Craighead County, Arkansas, looked exactly as it had on countless other school days. The first hours of class unfolded according to routine. Students settled into their lessons, teachers moved from one classroom to another, and the sounds filling the hallways were the ordinary sounds of a school nearing lunchtime. Nothing about the day appeared unusual. There were no warnings, no visible threats, and no indication that within a matter of minutes the campus would become one of the most tragic crime scenes in modern American history. Schools are places built on trust. Parents send their children through the front doors each morning believing they will return home. That afternoon, teachers devote their careers to creating environments where learning can happen safely. Fire drills, attendance rolls, classroom routines, and emergency procedures all exist for one reason: to protect the people inside the building. At Westside Middle School, those procedures had been practiced repeatedly. Students knew exactly what to do when the fire alarm sounded. They were taught not to panic, not to hesitate, and to follow their teachers outside in an orderly fashion. It was a lesson meant to save lives. On this particular Tuesday, that lesson would instead become part of a carefully planned trap. At approximately 12:35 p.m., the fire alarm suddenly rang throughout the school. There was no smoke drifting through the corridors. No flames appeared beneath classroom doors. Yet none of that mattered. The alarm demanded immediate action. Teachers instructed students to leave their classrooms just as they had done during previous drills. Hundreds of children began filing outside. Some talked quietly with classmates as they walked. Others believed it was simply another unexpected interruption to the school day. For many, there was no reason to feel afraid. They had followed this routine before. Outside, however, hidden from immediate view, two boys were waiting. They had already selected their position. They had already brought firearms. They had already decided exactly how they intended the evacuation to unfold. The alarm had never been intended as a warning. It was bait. The evacuation itself was the first stage of the attack. Within moments of students and teachers gathering outside the building, gunfire erupted from a concealed location near the school grounds. Confusion spread instantly. The first shots were so unexpected that some people reportedly struggled to understand what they were hearing. A fire alarm had just sounded. No one anticipated rifle fire. Within seconds, panic replaced routine. Students scattered in different directions while teachers attempted to shield children and guide them away from danger. The attack lasted only a short time, but its consequences would endure for decades. When the shooting stopped, 5 innocent people had lost their lives. Shannon Dawn Wright, a 32-year-old teacher, was killed alongside 4 young students. Natalie Brooks, age 11, Paige and Herring, age 12, Stephanie Johnson, age 12, and Brittany Varner, age 11. 10 additional victims, 9 students and 1 teacher, were wounded. The entire attack unfolded in only a matter of minutes. Yet it permanently altered the lives of families, classmates, teachers, first responders, and an entire community that had believed such violence belonged somewhere else. The horror of Jonesboro was measured not only by the number of casualties, but also by the ages of those responsible. One of the shooters, Andrew Douglas Golden, was only 11 years old. His accomplice, Mitchell Scott Johnson, was 13. Their ages stunned investigators almost as much as the crime itself. Mass shootings were already becoming an increasingly disturbing subject in the United States during the late 1990s. But few people imagined that children barely into adolescence could carefully plan and carry out such an attack. As news organizations rushed to report the story, the nation struggled with questions that seemed impossible to answer. How could boys so young obtain multiple firearms? How could they organize an ambush? Why would children target classmates and teachers they saw every day? Those questions echoed far beyond Arkansas. The attack occurred during a period when America had already witnessed several school shootings. Within a relatively short span of time, incidents in Pearl, Mississippi, and Heath High School in Kentucky had already generated intense public concern. Researchers and investigators increasingly discussed what would later become known as the copycat effect, the possibility that extensive publicity surrounding acts of violence could influence other vulnerable individuals. Although no single explanation would ever fully account for the tragedy in Jonesboro, the case quickly became part of a larger national conversation about youth violence, media attention, firearm access, and school safety. Yet behind every headline were real people whose ordinary Tuesday never reached its expected conclusion. For the students inside Westside Middle School that morning, there had been homework to finish, conversations with friends to continue, and plans for after school. Teachers were thinking about lessons rather than life-and-death emergencies. Parents expected another routine afternoon pickup. Instead, emergency vehicles soon converged on the campus. Law enforcement officers rushed toward the scene, while medical personnel began treating the wounded. Families received phone calls that no parent ever wishes to answer. As investigators worked to secure the area, they quickly learned that the 2 suspects had attempted to leave the scene but were captured near the school. Firearms, ammunition, and additional supplies were recovered, reinforcing investigators' conclusion that the attack had been planned rather than committed on impulse. Even with the suspects in custody, however, the most difficult questions remained unanswered. Understanding how the attack happened would prove far easier than understanding why it happened. The shooting at Westside Middle School would ultimately become one of the defining criminal cases of the late 20th century. It prompted renewed debate about juvenile justice, school emergency procedures, firearm access, and the responsibilities communities share in recognizing warning signs before violence occurs. It also demonstrated how quickly an ordinary routine could be transformed into unimaginable tragedy when trust itself became a weapon. The fire alarm that rang through the school that afternoon had been designed to protect lives. Instead, it drew teachers and students into the open, exactly where the attackers expected them to be. That single decision, to transform a universally recognized safety signal into part of an ambush, became one of the most haunting aspects of the entire case. Even years later, survivors, investigators, educators, and families would continue reflecting on those few minutes, searching for lessons that might prevent another community from experiencing the same loss. To understand how such a carefully orchestrated attack could emerge from two boys who were only 11 and 13 years old, it is necessary to step back from the crime scene itself and examine the environment in which it unfolded. Before the sirens, before the investigation, before the courtroom debates and national headlines, there was a quiet Arkansas community where neighbors knew one another, where hunting was part of everyday life for many families, and where Westside Middle School represented exactly what every school is meant to represent: a place of learning, safety, and hope. The tragedy that unfolded there did not begin with the first gunshot. It began long before the fire alarm sounded, hidden beneath the surface of an otherwise ordinary spring morning. Before the events of March 24, 1998, Westside Middle School was known simply as the local middle school serving families living in and around Jonesboro, Arkansas. The surrounding area reflected many characteristics of rural America. It was a community where neighbors often recognized one another, where families attended the same churches for generations, and where outdoor activities such as fishing, hunting, and camping were common parts of daily life. Firearms were present in many households, largely associated with recreation and hunting rather than violence. For many parents, teaching children how to safely handle hunting rifles was viewed as a normal responsibility rather than an unusual practice. Within that environment, few people imagined that familiar objects intended for lawful purposes could eventually become instruments of one of the most shocking school shootings in American history. Westside Middle School itself represented stability. Like thousands of schools across the United States, it operated according to routines designed to provide structure and predictability. Students arrived each morning expecting another day of lessons, friendships, sports, and ordinary adolescent concerns. Teachers focused on education, discipline, and encouraging young people as they navigated the difficult transition between childhood and adolescence. Emergency drills, including fire evacuations, were conducted because schools constantly prepared for accidents or natural emergencies. Those procedures were designed with a single assumption: adults and students would cooperate to protect one another. The possibility that someone inside the school community would deliberately manipulate those procedures into part of a planned attack was almost unimaginable. That sense of security made the tragedy especially devastating. It was not merely the violence itself that shocked the community, but the realization that a trusted system intended to keep children safe had been exploited. Every parent who sent a child to school believed that routine would continue uninterrupted. Every teacher expected another ordinary afternoon. Instead, lives were permanently changed within minutes. Behind every statistic associated with the case stood individuals whose futures were suddenly erased or forever altered. The 5 people who lost their lives were not simply names included in court documents or news reports. They were daughters, students, a teacher, friends, classmates, and family members whose absence left lasting wounds throughout the community. Shannon Dawn Wright was 32 years old and worked as a teacher at Westside Middle School. Like countless educators across the country, she had chosen a profession centered on helping young people learn and grow. Teachers often become mentors, role models, and trusted adults whose influence extends well beyond the classroom. On the day of the shooting, Shannon Wright was carrying out those ordinary responsibilities when the attack began. During the chaos, she attempted to protect students under her care. She was fatally wounded, becoming the only adult killed in the attack. Her death represented more than the loss of a teacher. It symbolized the risks educators sometimes face while placing the safety of children above their own. In the years that followed, her name would continue to be remembered not only because she was among the victims, but because her actions reflected the protective role teachers instinctively assume during moments of crisis. Natalie Brooks was only 11 years old. Like the other students who died that afternoon, she had arrived at school expecting nothing more extraordinary than another Tuesday. At 11 years old, life is normally measured by classroom assignments, friendships, family activities, and the anticipation of growing older. Those ordinary expectations ended the moment the carefully planned ambush began. Natalie became one of the youngest victims of the attack, her future ending before she had even reached high school. Paige and Herring was 12 years old. She, too, had been following the evacuation procedures taught by her school. She did exactly what students are instructed to do when an alarm sounds: leave the building calmly and gather outside. There was no opportunity to recognize danger in time to avoid it. The attack unfolded so rapidly that the students assembled outside had virtually no chance to protect themselves. Paige's death became another painful reminder that the victims had not ignored safety instructions. They had obeyed them. Stephanie Johnson, also 12 years old, shared no family relationship with Mitchell Scott Johnson despite the similarity in their surnames. That fact became an important clarification during media coverage, as some early reports caused confusion. Stephanie was simply another student whose life intersected with the attack because she happened to be present at school that afternoon. Like every other child on campus, she trusted the adults and procedures designed to ensure her safety. Brittany Varner, 11 years old, was another young student whose injuries proved fatal. Her family, like the families of every victim, suddenly found themselves confronting a reality no parent expects when saying goodbye to a child before school. The loss of 4 children in a single attack transformed countless ordinary family memories into final memories. Birthdays, holidays, graduations, and future milestones would forever include the absence created on that spring afternoon. Beyond those who lost their lives, 10 additional people survived with injuries, 9 students and 1 teacher. While official casualty figures summarize the physical consequences of the attack, they cannot fully express the long-term impact experienced by survivors. Every injured student carried memories of those few terrifying moments. Every classmate who escaped without physical injury nevertheless witnessed a level of violence almost impossible to reconcile with the familiar surroundings of a school campus. Teachers who survived returned to classrooms forever changed by what they had experienced. Parents faced the challenge of helping children recover from fear while coping with their own grief and uncertainty. The emotional effects extended well beyond those physically present. Jonesboro itself became identified nationwide with a tragedy that residents had never anticipated. News organizations from across the country descended upon the community, transforming a quiet Arkansas town into the focus of national attention. Reporters searched for explanations. Experts debated warning signs. Politicians discussed school safety and juvenile violence. Yet for local families, the story was far more personal than any national debate. It was about neighbors they knew, children they recognized, and teachers they trusted. The victims were not anonymous faces appearing briefly on television. They were members of a close-knit community suddenly forced to confront unimaginable loss. The attack also challenged one of society's deepest assumptions, that schools are among the safest places children can be. Parents routinely entrust schools with the care of their sons and daughters for much of each weekday. That trust depends on the belief that classrooms provide protection, guidance, and opportunity. When violence enters such a place, the damage reaches beyond the immediate victims because it disrupts a fundamental sense of security shared by families everywhere. The Westside Middle School shooting forced communities across the United States to reconsider emergency planning, school security, and preparedness in ways that previously seemed unnecessary. It also became part of a growing national awareness that school shootings were no longer isolated anomalies. Nevertheless, amid discussions about policy, security, and criminal justice, it remains essential to remember the individuals whose lives were forever changed. The story of West Side Middle School is not simply the story of two boys who committed a terrible crime. It is equally, and perhaps more importantly, the story of the people whose futures were taken from them, and of a community whose ordinary sense of safety disappeared within minutes. Understanding that human cost provides the necessary foundation for examining the two young perpetrators. Their actions would dominate headlines and courtroom proceedings. But the lasting significance of the case lies in the lives interrupted, the families left grieving, and the enduring effort to understand how such extraordinary violence emerged from children who, only days earlier, had appeared to be ordinary students within an ordinary Arkansas community. In order to understand how that transformation occurred, investigators would soon begin examining the backgrounds of the two boys at the center of the case. Starting with the younger of the pair, 11-year-old Andrew Douglas Golden. Andrew Douglas Golden was only 11 years old when his name became known across the United States. His age alone seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the scale of the crime that investigators would later reconstruct. For many people following the story in the days after the shooting, the first reaction was disbelief. The public had grown accustomed to hearing about violent offenders who were adults or older teenagers. But an 11-year-old child occupying the center of a planned mass shooting challenged deeply held assumptions about childhood itself. Questions emerged almost immediately. Who was Andrew Golden before March 24, 1998? Had there been obvious warning signs? Could anyone have predicted what would happen? As investigators, journalists, and members of the community searched for answers, they discovered a picture that was far more complicated than a simple narrative of good and evil. Like many children growing up in rural Arkansas, Andrew spent much of his early life surrounded by the outdoors. Hunting, fishing, and camping were familiar activities rather than unusual hobbies. In many families throughout the region, learning how to safely handle firearms was considered a normal part of growing up. Rifles were tools associated with hunting and recreation, and responsible firearm use was often taught by parents or grandparents. Andrew was introduced to firearms at a young age and became comfortable using them. According to those who knew him, he possessed knowledge that exceeded what many people would expect from an 11-year-old. He understood how to load firearms, how to aim accurately, and how to shoot at targets from a distance. Those skills, harmless when practiced responsibly under adult supervision, would later become one of the most disturbing elements of the investigation. Authorities would conclude that Andrew's familiarity with rifles played a significant role in the planning and execution of the attack. Yet familiarity with firearms alone could never explain why violence occurred. Thousands of children in similar communities learned to hunt without ever committing crimes. The investigation therefore focused not only on Andrew's access to weapons, but also on his behavior, personality, and relationships. People who had interacted with him before the shooting described him in different ways, reflecting the complexity often found in young children. Some remembered him as intelligent and capable. Others recalled a boy who enjoyed outdoor activities and spent time hunting with family members. These descriptions did not immediately suggest someone preparing for a mass shooting. At the same time, acquaintances also described troubling aspects of his behavior. Andrew was known to have a temper. He could become angry quickly, and some people recalled incidents in which he bullied other children. These accounts later received considerable attention because investigators and researchers often examine aggressive behavior when attempting to understand violent crimes. However, it is important to recognize that many children display anger or engage in bullying without ever progressing to extreme violence. Looking backward after a tragedy can make ordinary behavioral problems appear more significant than they seemed at the time. Before March 24th, few people believed Andrew represented a serious threat capable of planning multiple murders. That disconnect became one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. The contrast between appearance and reality challenged assumptions held by teachers, parents, neighbors, and investigators alike. Another important factor examined during the investigation was Andrew's access to firearms within his family environment. According to investigators, multiple firearms used in planning the attack had been taken from the home of his grandfather. The availability of these weapons became a major subject of public discussion after the shooting. Questions emerged regarding firearm storage, supervision, and how children could gain access to rifles and ammunition without immediate detection. Those broader debates would continue long after the criminal proceedings concluded, influencing conversations about firearm safety throughout the United States. For Andrew himself, however, access was only one element within a much larger sequence of events. Possessing firearms did not automatically determine criminal behavior. Instead, investigators sought to understand how those weapons became integrated into a deliberate plan. Throughout the investigation, authorities found evidence suggesting that the attack had not been spontaneous. Firearms were gathered in advance. Ammunition had been prepared. Other equipment had been assembled. Such preparation required cooperation with another participant, 13-year-old Mitchell Scott Johnson. Understanding Andrew, therefore, also required understanding the friendship that had developed between the two boys. Before examining that relationship, however, investigators first attempted to establish Andrew's individual role within the planning process. One characteristic repeatedly noted was his familiarity with accurate shooting. Individuals who knew him described his experience using rifles during hunting activities. That experience meant he possessed practical skills uncommon among children living in urban environments. During later discussions about the case, commentators sometimes focused heavily on those abilities, but investigators remained careful not to confuse skill with motive. Knowing how to operate a firearm explained part of how the attack became possible, yet it did not explain why it occurred. Motive remained far more difficult to establish. As authorities interviewed witnesses and examined evidence, they found no single event in Andrew's life that could fully account for the crime. Unlike fictional crime stories, real investigations rarely produce simple answers. Human behavior often emerges from numerous overlapping influences rather than one decisive cause. The available evidence in the West Side case reflected exactly that complexity. There was no definitive statement explaining the attack, no single grievance supported by conclusive evidence, and no straightforward psychological profile capable of answering every question. This uncertainty became one of the defining characteristics of the investigation. Even today, discussions of the case continue to acknowledge that important questions remain unresolved. From a broader perspective, Andrew's story forced Americans to confront difficult realities about childhood. Society often views childhood as a period largely protected from deliberate acts of extreme violence. Children are generally seen as individuals still developing emotionally, socially, and morally. The notion that an 11-year-old could participate in planning an organized ambush fundamentally challenged those expectations. Media coverage frequently emphasized Andrew's age because it represented one of the most extraordinary aspects of the case. Yet focusing solely on age risked oversimplifying a tragedy that investigators consistently described as carefully prepared rather than impulsive. Behind the headlines, law enforcement officers were methodically reconstructing each step leading to March 24th. Every recovered firearm, every piece of ammunition, and every item discovered after the arrest contributed to a timeline demonstrating advanced planning. Andrew's role within that preparation would become increasingly clear as evidence accumulated. Nevertheless, the investigation also revealed that he had not acted alone. Standing beside him throughout the planning and execution of the attack was Mitchell Scott Johnson, 2 years older and already known among classmates for behavior that attracted attention long before the shooting occurred. If Andrew brought familiarity with firearms and hunting, Mitchell appeared to bring a different set of influences and experiences. Understanding how those two boys formed their partnership would become essential to understanding how one ordinary school day ended in extraordinary violence. Their friendship, built around shared interests in hunting, firearms, military-style games, and camping, gradually evolved into something investigators would later describe as the foundation of a carefully organized ambush. Examining Andrew in isolation, therefore, provides only part of the story. The next chapter shifts attention to Mitchell Johnson, whose background, reputation, and relationship with Andrew would reveal how two young lives became intertwined in one of the most devastating school shootings of the late 20th century. Mitchell Scott Johnson was 13 years old when the events at West Side Middle School unfolded, making him the older of the two perpetrators. Although only 2 years separated Mitchell from Andrew Douglas Golden, those years carried important differences in maturity, school experience, and reputation among classmates. By the time investigators began examining his background, they found that Mitchell had already attracted attention at school in ways that distinguished him from many of his peers. Unlike Andrew, whose familiarity with firearms was one of the most frequently discussed aspects of his upbringing, Mitchell was remembered by many classmates for the image he tried to project. According to accounts gathered after the shooting, he often attempted to present himself as someone who was tougher, more dangerous, and more experienced than his age suggested. Some classmates recalled hearing him make claims about gangs, drugs, or criminal associations. Investigators found no evidence confirming that these statements reflected genuine involvement in organized criminal activity. Instead, many who knew him believed that the stories were largely attempts to impress or intimidate other students. For adolescents navigating the uncertainties of middle school, projecting a particular image is not uncommon. Many young teenagers exaggerate accomplishments, invent stories, or adopt identities they believe will earn attention or respect. In Mitchell's case, however, those memories took on new significance after the shooting because people naturally search backward for warning signs that might explain the unimaginable. As often happens following major crimes, ordinary behavior was re-examined through the lens of tragedy. Teachers, classmates, and investigators asked themselves whether comments that once seemed like adolescent boasting should have been interpreted differently. Yet hindsight has a way of making scattered details appear more connected than they seemed before. The crime occurred. Another aspect of Mitchell's background that emerged during the investigation involved disciplinary problems at school. Reports indicated that he had been involved in fights, had experienced disciplinary action, and had made threats toward classmates on previous occasions. Such incidents contributed to a reputation for being confrontational, though they did not lead those around him to conclude that he would someday participate in a planned mass shooting. Schools across the country regularly deal with students who argue, fight, or display behavioral difficulties. Those challenges are serious, but they rarely develop into acts of large-scale violence. The difficulty for investigators and educators alike lay in determining which warning signs truly indicated escalating danger and which reflected the impulsive behavior common during adolescence. Mitchell's personal relationships also became a subject of intense public discussion after the shooting. News reports at the time explored claims that he had experienced conflicts involving girls at school, and that feelings of rejection may have contributed to his emotional state. These reports quickly became part of the national conversation surrounding the case. However, despite widespread speculation, investigators never established a single personal conflict as the definitive motive behind the attack. While interpersonal tensions may have existed, the available evidence did not support the conclusion that the entire shooting was planned simply as revenge against one individual. This distinction remains important because the search for a motive often encourages overly simple explanations for extraordinarily complex crimes. Throughout the investigation, authorities consistently emphasized that no single factor adequately explained why the attack occurred. Rather than identifying one clear cause, investigators found themselves examining multiple possibilities, each offering only part of the picture. Questions about personal grievances, the desire for attention, fascination with firearms, and possible influence from previous acts of school violence all became subjects of discussion. Yet none fully answered the central question of why two boys would organize such a devastating attack. If Mitchell's background raised difficult questions, his relationship with Andrew Golden raised even more. The two boys shared several interests that naturally brought them together. Both enjoyed hunting, camping, firearms, and military-style games. In many communities, friendships develop around common hobbies, and theirs initially appeared no different. Spending time outdoors, discussing hunting equipment, or participating in recreational activities would not, by themselves, have drawn concern. Investigators later determined, however, that these shared interests provided opportunities for the boys to spend considerable time together, gradually strengthening a friendship that would eventually become central to the planning of the attack. According to information gathered after the shooting, Mitchell was often perceived as the more dominant personality within the pair. Andrew, meanwhile, possessed stronger familiarity with rifles and practical shooting skills developed through hunting. Together, their different strengths appeared to complement one another during the planning process reconstructed by investigators. Mitchell's reputation for wanting to appear fearless or intimidating contrasted with Andrew's technical familiarity with firearms. Neither characteristic alone explains what followed, but together they formed part of the broader context investigators examined while reconstructing events. Witnesses also recalled occasions when the two boys joked or spoke casually about violence. Such comments were not necessarily interpreted seriously at the time. Adolescents sometimes make inappropriate or exaggerated statements without intending to act upon them. Following the tragedy, however, those recollections became subjects of careful scrutiny. Investigators interviewed classmates, teachers, and others in an effort to distinguish ordinary youthful immaturity from statements that might have reflected genuine planning. This process illustrated one of the greatest challenges faced after crimes of this nature. Human memory is influenced by subsequent events. Once people know the outcome, previous conversations often acquire meanings that seemed invisible beforehand. Law enforcement therefore relied not only on witness recollections, but also on physical evidence to establish what had actually occurred. As investigators continued piecing together the timeline, they concluded that the shooting had been planned in advance rather than carried out impulsively. That conclusion shifted attention toward the practical preparations made before March 24th. Firearms had to be obtained, ammunition had to be gathered, transportation had to be arranged, a firing position had to be selected. Each of these steps required cooperation between the two boys. The partnership between Mitchell and Andrew, therefore, became one of the defining features of the case. Neither boy acted independently. Instead, investigators found evidence indicating coordinated preparation leading up to the attack. Understanding that partnership also helped explain why the crime shocked the nation so profoundly. The image of two middle school students working together to organize an ambush challenged conventional assumptions about juvenile crime. The planning demonstrated organization rather than spontaneous anger, making the case particularly disturbing to both investigators and the public. Despite extensive investigation, however, authorities remain cautious about attributing specific psychological roles to either participant beyond what the evidence supported. It was tempting for observers to describe one as the leader and the other as the follower. Yet the available facts did not provide a simple division of responsibility. Both boys participated in the planning and execution of the attack. Both were ultimately held responsible within the juvenile justice system. Beyond questions of individual responsibility, the friendship itself became an important reminder of how relationships can influence behavior during adolescence. Young people often spend significant amounts of time together, sharing interests, ideas, and activities. In the overwhelming majority of cases, those friendships are positive influences. In the case of Mitchell Johnson and Andrew Golden, investigators concluded that their shared interests gradually evolved into cooperation in planning violence. Exactly how that transformation occurred remains one of the unresolved aspects of the case. There was no single documented conversation that explained the transition from ordinary friendship to criminal conspiracy. Instead, investigators reconstructed the sequence through physical evidence and the events that unfolded on March 24th. By the time that day arrived, the friendship had moved far beyond shared hobbies. According to the investigation, the boys had already obtained firearms, gathered ammunition, assembled supplies, selected a concealed location overlooking the school, and prepared transportation. These were not actions completed in moments of anger. They reflected deliberate preparation carried out before the first shot was fired. The planning itself would become one of the most significant findings of the investigation because it demonstrated that the tragedy at West Side Middle School was not the result of an impulsive outburst. It was the culmination of decisions made in advance. Understanding those preparations requires examining the days leading up to March 24th, when the theft of weapons, the gathering of equipment, and the selection of an ambush site transformed disturbing thoughts into a carefully organized plan that would forever alter the lives of an Arkansas community. As investigators reconstructed the events leading to March 24th, 1998, one conclusion became increasingly clear. The tragedy at West Side Middle School had not emerged from a sudden argument, a spontaneous outburst of anger, or a momentary lapse in judgment. Instead, the available evidence pointed toward preparation carried out before the first shot was ever fired. Every major step required planning, coordination, and deliberate action. By carefully examining the physical evidence recovered after the attack, along with the sequence of events established through the investigation, authorities were able to piece together how two boys, only 11 and 13 years old, prepared for an assault that would shock the nation. One of the earliest stages of that preparation involved obtaining firearms. According to investigators, Andrew Douglas Golden removed multiple weapons from his family's collection, including firearms belonging to his grandfather. Growing up in an environment where hunting was common meant Andrew was already familiar with the location of the firearms and understood how they operated. The weapons recovered during the investigation included rifles and a handgun, although not every firearm brought to the scene was ultimately used during the attack. Authorities also recovered a substantial quantity of ammunition, demonstrating that the boys had not acted with whatever happened to be immediately available. Instead, they had deliberately gathered the equipment they believed would support their plan. This discovery reinforced investigators' belief that the attack had been organized before the morning of March 24th rather than conceived in response to any sudden event occurring at school that day. The presence of multiple firearms immediately raised broader questions concerning access to weapons by juveniles. Public debate following the shooting frequently centered on how children could obtain guns without immediate detection. Yet within the investigation itself, the central issue was less about public policy and more about reconstructing the sequence of events. Investigators needed to determine when the firearms had been taken, how they had been transported, and how they eventually reached the concealed position outside West Side Middle School. Each answer added another piece to the developing timeline. Alongside the firearms came ammunition. Investigators determined that the boys had assembled sufficient ammunition before the attack. This preparation demonstrated forethought rather than impulse. Ammunition does not appear by accident, nor does it accompany an emotional outburst without prior planning. The recovery of ammunition after the arrests became another important factor supporting investigators' conclusion that the attack had been carefully organized. The next major element of preparation involved transportation. According to the investigation, Mitchell Scott Johnson obtained a small pickup truck belonging to his family. The vehicle served several purposes within the overall plan. First, it allowed the boys to transport firearms and equipment to the area surrounding the school without carrying everything on foot. Second, it provided a means of leaving the scene after the shooting. When authorities later examined the truck, they discovered items extending beyond weapons and ammunition. Investigators recovered clothing, food, camping supplies, and additional equipment. The presence of these materials became one of the most significant findings during the investigation, because it suggested the possibility that the boys had anticipated leaving the area following the attack rather than immediately surrendering. Investigators interpreted the collection of supplies as evidence that some degree of preparation had been made for events after the shooting itself. While authorities could not establish every detail of what the boys expected would happen once the attack concluded, the equipment inside the vehicle strongly indicated that they had considered the period following the shooting as part of their planning process. The camping equipment also reflected one of the shared interests connecting Andrew and Mitchell. Both boys enjoyed outdoor activities, and the supplies recovered from the truck were consistent with those interests. However, within the context of the investigation, those ordinary recreational items acquired a different significance. Combined with firearms, ammunition, transportation, and the timing of the attack, they formed part of a broader pattern demonstrating preparation rather than coincidence. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the planning involved the selection of the attack location itself. Unlike later school shootings in which attackers entered buildings directly, the West Side Middle School attack relied upon concealment. Investigators determined that the boys selected a wooded area near the school that offered several tactical advantages. Trees and brush provided cover from immediate observation. The location overlooked portions of the school grounds where students and teachers would gather. After evacuating the building, the position also sat at a slightly elevated point, allowing a relatively clear view toward the area outside the school. These characteristics were not accidental. Investigators concluded that the location had been deliberately chosen because it combined concealment with visibility. From there, the attackers could observe the evacuation while remaining difficult to detect during the opening moments of the assault. This selection of terrain became one of the defining features distinguishing the West Side shooting from many other acts of school violence. Rather than entering classrooms, the attackers intended to draw potential victims outside before opening fire. The fire alarm became an essential component of that strategy. According to the investigation, the evacuation procedure itself was transformed into part of the attack. Every student and teacher had been taught to respond immediately when the alarm sounded. Fire drills existed to save lives in emergencies involving smoke or flames. The attackers exploited that predictable response. By activating the alarm, they could reasonably expect that hundreds of people would leave the safety of the building and assemble in areas visible from their concealed position. Investigators later recognized this as one of the most disturbing elements of the case because it demonstrated not only planning but also an understanding of routine school procedures. The boys relied upon those procedures functioning exactly as intended. Without an orderly evacuation, the ambush would not unfold in the manner they anticipated. The location selected outside the school further reflected familiarity with the campus. Andrew attended West Side Middle School and therefore understood the layout of the buildings, the evacuation routes, and the surrounding terrain. Investigators believed this knowledge contributed to the selection of the firing position. The wooded area was close enough to provide an effective line of sight while still offering natural concealment. The attackers did not need to improvise after arriving. The location had already been chosen. As the investigation continued, authorities examined each stage of the planning process individually, but it was the combination of these preparations that ultimately convinced them the crime had been carefully organized. Firearms had been obtained in advance. Ammunition had been gathered. Transportation had been arranged. Supplies suggesting possible flight had been loaded into the truck. A concealed firing position had been selected. Finally, the plan depended upon triggering a fire alarm at precisely the right moment to bring students and teachers into the open. None of these steps appeared consistent with spontaneous violence. Instead, together they formed a sequence of deliberate actions leading toward a single objective. Even so, investigators remained unable to identify one definitive motive explaining why the preparations had begun in the first place. The evidence established how the attack had been organized far more clearly than why it had been conceived. That distinction would remain one of the enduring characteristics of the case. The physical evidence answered practical questions while leaving deeper psychological questions unresolved. By the morning of March 24th, every major element of the plan was already in place. The firearms had been assembled, the truck prepared, the wooded position selected, and the strategy built around the fire alarm was ready to be carried out. What remained was execution. At approximately midday, while students attended classes believing they were experiencing another ordinary Tuesday, the final stage of the plan began. One boy remained inside the school building. The other waited outside, near the concealed firing position. Within minutes, a fire alarm would ring through the hallways, and a routine safety procedure practiced countless times before would become the opening act of one of the most devastating school shootings in American history. The morning of March 24th, 1998, unfolded with remarkable normality at West Side Middle School. Teachers moved through their scheduled lessons, students focused on assignments, and the ordinary rhythm of a school day continued without interruption. There were no visible signs that anything unusual was about to happen. Children spoke with classmates about homework, lunchtime, and the small concerns that typically occupy middle school students. Staff members followed familiar routines that had been repeated countless times before. Looking back after the tragedy, survivors would often describe those early hours as completely ordinary, a detail that made the violence that followed even more difficult to comprehend. For investigators reconstructing the timeline, establishing this sense of normalcy was important because it demonstrated that the attack was not triggered by an immediate confrontation inside the school. According to the evidence, the plan was already in motion before classes even reached the middle of the day. During those morning hours, Andrew Douglas Golden remained inside the school building as a student. Mitchell Scott Johnson, meanwhile, positioned himself outside near the concealed location that investigators later identified as the firing point. Their separation reflected the strategy authorities would later reconstruct. One participant remained within the normal flow of school activity, while the other waited near the wooded area overlooking the evacuation zone. The investigation found that this arrangement allowed the final stage of the plan to unfold. According to their expectations, at approximately 12:35 p.m., the critical moment arrived. Andrew activated the school's fire alarm. Throughout the building, the familiar alarm echoed through classrooms and hallways. There was no visible smoke. No flames spread through the corridors. No obvious signs suggested that a fire threatened the building. Nevertheless, the purpose of an emergency alarm is to prompt immediate action rather than debate. Teachers followed established safety procedures exactly as they had been trained to do. They instructed students to leave classrooms calmly and move toward designated evacuation areas. Outside, hundreds of students and faculty members complied. The evacuation itself unfolded according to routine. For the children leaving their classrooms, there was no reason to suspect that the alarm had been intentionally triggered. Fire drills were familiar experiences. Students had practiced them repeatedly. They trusted the procedures because those procedures existed to protect them. In the tragic irony that would later define the entire case, the very system designed to preserve life had become the mechanism drawing potential victims into the open. Investigators would later identify this manipulation of emergency procedures as one of the most calculated aspects of the attack. Rather than entering the school with firearms, the attackers relied on predictable human behavior. They expected students and teachers to respond exactly as safety training required. Their plan depended upon that trust. As students exited the building, teachers worked to maintain order. They directed children toward assembly areas while accounting for their classes. Nothing in those first moments suggested that danger waited nearby. Then, from the concealed wooded position overlooking the school grounds, gunfire erupted. The first shots shattered the ordinary sounds of the evacuation. Witnesses later described the initial confusion that followed. Because no one expected an armed attack during what appeared to be a routine fire evacuation. Some people reportedly struggled to recognize the sounds immediately. Within moments, however, the reality became unmistakable. Students and teachers began falling to the ground. Panic spread across the evacuation area as those present realized they were under attack. The carefully chosen firing position allowed the attackers to observe the gathering crowd while remaining partially concealed by trees and brush. Investigators concluded that this location had been selected precisely because it combined visibility with cover. Those outside the building had little warning and almost no opportunity to identify where the shots were originating before chaos overtook the scene. As fear spread through the crowd, students reacted instinctively. Some attempted to run from the area. Others sought whatever cover they could find. Teachers immediately shifted from supervising a routine evacuation to attempting to protect the children around them. Amid the confusion, several educators tried to guide students away from danger despite having only seconds to react. One of those teachers was Shannon Dawn Wright, 32 years old. Wright was carrying out the ordinary responsibilities of an educator when the attack began. During the chaos, she attempted to protect students in her care. She was fatally wounded during the attack, becoming the only adult killed that afternoon. Her actions reflected the instinctive responsibility many educators feel toward the children entrusted to them, even under the most dangerous circumstances. The students caught in the evacuation area had no realistic opportunity to defend themselves. They had done exactly what school officials had instructed them to do by leaving the building after the alarm sounded. Among those killed were 11-year-old Natalie Brooks, 12-year-old Paige and Herring, 12-year-old Stephanie Johnson, and 11-year-old Brittany Varner. Each of them had arrived at school expecting an ordinary Tuesday. None could have anticipated that following routine safety procedures would place them directly in the path of a planned ambush. In addition to the 5 fatalities, 9 students and 1 teacher suffered gunshot wounds. Some required extensive medical treatment and lengthy recoveries. Although official records summarize the attack by listing casualties, those numbers cannot fully convey the terror experienced by the survivors. For many students, the attack lasted only moments, yet those moments remained vivid for years afterward. The violence unfolded with extraordinary speed. Unlike prolonged hostage situations or extended armed confrontations, the shooting at West Side Middle School occurred within a matter of minutes. The attackers fired into the gathering crowd before moving away from their concealed position. Investigators later determined that the entire sequence, from activation of the fire alarm to the conclusion of the shooting, took place rapidly, leaving little opportunity for organized resistance or protective action. Once the shooting ended, Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson left the firing position and headed toward the pickup truck prepared earlier as part of their plan. According to the investigation, the vehicle contained not only firearms and ammunition, but also camping equipment, food, clothing, and other supplies. These items reinforced investigators' belief that the boys had prepared for events beyond the attack itself. Whether they expected to remain away from home for an extended period or had developed another plan after leaving the scene could not be fully established from the available evidence. What investigators could confirm was that preparations for departure had been made before the shooting began. Their attempt to leave the area, however, was unsuccessful. Emergency calls reached authorities almost immediately after gunfire erupted. School personnel and witnesses quickly contacted emergency services, allowing law enforcement officers and medical responders to move toward the campus without delay. Police arrived within minutes, securing the scene while emergency medical personnel began assisting the wounded. The rapid law enforcement response prevented the attackers from escaping. Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson were apprehended near the school before they could travel any significant distance. At the time of their arrest, authorities recovered firearms, ammunition, and the additional equipment transported in the pickup truck. The recovery of these items became critical evidence during the investigation because it helped establish the degree of planning involved. Physical evidence, combined with witness statements and the reconstructed timeline, allowed investigators to understand the sequence of events with considerable clarity. By the end of that afternoon, the immediate threat had ended. The two perpetrators were in custody. The school grounds had become an active crime scene. Families desperately searched for information about loved ones. Medical teams worked to treat the injured. Investigators began documenting every piece of evidence while attempting to answer the questions already emerging across the nation. The attack itself had lasted only minutes, yet its consequences would shape discussions about school safety, juvenile violence, firearm access, and emergency planning for years to come. Even with the shooters in custody and the physical evidence carefully collected, however, one question remained profoundly difficult to answer. Investigators had successfully reconstructed how the attack unfolded. From the stolen firearms to the fire alarm, the concealed firing position, and the attempted escape. What remained uncertain was why two boys, only 11 and 13 years old, had chosen to carry out such a carefully planned act of violence. Answering that question would become the next and perhaps most challenging stage of the investigation. By the time the gunfire ended on March 24, 1998, the immediate danger at West Side Middle School had passed. But the work of understanding what had happened was only beginning. The campus, which only minutes earlier had been filled with students following a routine fire evacuation, was transformed into an active crime scene. Law enforcement officers arriving at the school faced two urgent priorities. The first was ensuring that no additional threat remained. The second was preserving evidence that could explain how such a carefully organized attack had been carried out. While emergency medical personnel treated the wounded and transported victims to hospitals, investigators began the painstaking process of documenting every detail that might help reconstruct the events of that afternoon. The speed with which emergency calls reached authorities played an important role in limiting the attackers' ability to leave the area. School personnel and witnesses contacted emergency services almost immediately after the shooting began. Responding officers arrived within minutes, securing the campus and searching for the suspects. Andrew Douglas Golden and Mitchell Scott Johnson had already left their concealed firing position and moved toward the pickup truck that had been prepared before the attack. Their attempt to leave the scene, however, lasted only a short time. Police located and apprehended both boys near the school before they could travel any significant distance. Their arrests effectively ended the immediate crisis and prevented what investigators feared might have become an extended manhunt. For law enforcement officers, taking the suspects into custody marked only the beginning of a much larger investigation. The physical evidence recovered during and after the arrests would become central to understanding how the crime had been planned. Officers recovered multiple firearms along with ammunition. They also examined the pickup truck used by the boys. Inside the vehicle, investigators found clothing, food, camping supplies, and additional equipment. Individually, many of these items were ordinary. Collectively, however, they suggested preparation extending beyond the shooting itself. Investigators concluded that the attack had not been conceived as an impulsive act committed without planning. Instead, the evidence indicated deliberate preparation carried out before March 24th. The camping equipment and supplies found in the truck attracted particular attention because they suggested that the boys had anticipated events occurring after the shooting. Although investigators could not determine every expectation the boys may have had regarding what would happen once the attack ended, the presence of these materials supported the conclusion that they had considered the possibility of leaving the immediate area. This finding became one of several factors reinforcing the belief that the crime had involved advanced planning rather than spontaneous violence. Once the suspects had been secured, investigators turned their attention back to the school grounds. The wooded area overlooking the evacuation zone became a primary focus of forensic examination. Authorities carefully documented the location from which the shots had been fired, studying its relationship to the school buildings and the designated evacuation areas. The terrain itself provided important answers. Trees and brush offered concealment while still allowing a clear view toward the area where students and teachers assembled after leaving the building. The slight elevation of the position gave the shooters an unobstructed line of sight over portions of the campus. Investigators concluded that this location had been selected deliberately because it combined visibility with cover. The physical characteristics of the site strongly supported the conclusion that the firing position had been chosen before the day of the attack. Another crucial element of the investigation involved reconstructing the timeline inside the school. Witness interviews and school records helped establish that Andrew Golden had remained inside the building until approximately 12:35 p.m. when the fire alarm was activated. Investigators determined that the alarm itself was not responding to an actual fire or emergency. Instead, it had been intentionally triggered to force an evacuation. This finding transformed the fire alarm from a routine safety device into one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. Authorities recognized that the evacuation procedure had not simply coincided with the attack. It had been intentionally incorporated into the overall plan. The alarm served as the mechanism that brought hundreds of students and teachers into the open, precisely where the attackers expected them to gather. Investigators carefully examined how emergency procedures had unfolded that afternoon. Teachers had acted exactly as their training required. Students had followed instructions exactly as they had been taught during previous fire drills. No evidence suggested that school personnel had acted improperly. On the contrary, the investigation demonstrated that the attackers had exploited the predictability of established safety procedures. This realization deeply affected educators nationwide because it illustrated that even well-designed emergency protocols could be manipulated under extraordinary circumstances. Witness interviews formed another essential part of the investigation. Students, teachers, school employees, and first responders each contributed observations that helped investigators reconstruct the sequence of events. Many witnesses described the confusion that followed the first gunshots. Because the attack occurred immediately after the fire alarm, several people initially struggled to understand what they were hearing. Others recalled seeing classmates and teachers attempting to escape while educators tried to protect children despite the chaos surrounding them. Investigators compared these statements with physical evidence to establish an accurate timeline, while recognizing that traumatic events can affect human memory. Rather than relying solely on recollections, authorities evaluated witness testimony alongside forensic findings, recovered weapons, and evidence collected from the scene. As investigators assembled the available evidence, a consistent picture emerged. Firearms had been gathered before the attack. Ammunition had been prepared. A pickup truck had been used to transport equipment. A concealed firing position had been selected because it overlooked the school's evacuation area. The fire alarm had been intentionally activated to draw people outside. Together, these findings demonstrated coordination and planning. There was little evidence supporting the idea of a spontaneous emotional outburst occurring during the school day. Instead, investigators concluded that multiple decisions had been made before March 24th, each contributing to the final outcome. Yet despite the growing clarity surrounding how the attack had unfolded. Investigators encountered far greater difficulty when attempting to explain why it had occurred. Physical evidence can establish timelines, identify weapons, and reconstruct movements. It cannot directly reveal human motivation. As interviews continued and evidence accumulated, authorities explored several possible explanations without identifying one definitive answer. They considered reported interpersonal conflicts, the boys' shared interest in firearms, their familiarity with hunting, and the possibility that previous highly publicized school shootings had influenced their thinking. Each theory appeared to explain part of the picture, but none fully accounted for the attack. Investigators remained cautious throughout the inquiry, avoiding conclusions that extended beyond what the evidence could support. This restraint reflected an important principle of criminal investigation. Extraordinary crimes often generate extraordinary speculation, but speculation cannot substitute for evidence. Although media coverage frequently sought simple explanations, investigators consistently acknowledged that no single motive had been conclusively established. Their responsibility was to distinguish between verified facts and assumptions, even when public pressure demanded immediate answers. As the investigation progressed, another significant issue emerged. Because both suspects were juveniles, one 11 years old and the other 13, the legal system would face circumstances rarely encountered in cases involving multiple homicides. Investigators completed the factual reconstruction of the crime, but the next phase would shift from the crime scene to the courtroom. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, victims' families, and the juvenile justice system would soon confront difficult legal questions about accountability, punishment, and the limits of existing law. The evidence collected at Westside Middle School had established how the attack had been planned and carried out. The challenge that remained was determining how the justice system should respond when the perpetrators of one of the nation's deadliest school shootings were themselves children under Arkansas law. As the criminal investigation progressed, attention gradually shifted from the physical evidence collected at Westside Middle School to the legal process that would determine how Andrew Douglas Golden and Mitchell Scott Johnson would be held accountable. By this stage, investigators had established the essential sequence of events. Firearms had been obtained before the attack. Ammunition had been gathered. A concealed firing position had been selected. The fire alarm had been intentionally activated to draw students and teachers outside before the shooting began. The suspects had been apprehended shortly afterward, and the evidence recovered from the scene and the pickup truck supported the conclusion that the attack had been carefully planned. What remained unresolved was not how the crime had occurred, but how the legal system should respond when those responsible were only 11 and 13 years old. This question quickly became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Across the United States, public reaction extended far beyond grief and shock. Families mourned the lives that had been lost. Communities reflected on the vulnerability of schools, and lawmakers faced renewed pressure to examine existing juvenile justice laws. Many people assumed that a crime involving multiple murders would automatically result in lengthy prison sentences. However, the legal framework governing juvenile offenders in Arkansas during 1998 operated very differently from the adult criminal justice system. Because Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson were both under the age required for adult prosecution in this case, their proceedings took place within the juvenile justice system rather than an adult criminal court. This distinction had profound consequences. Juvenile courts are designed around principles that differ from those applied to adult offenders. Although accountability remains an essential objective, juvenile systems historically place greater emphasis on rehabilitation than on punishment alone. These principles reflect the recognition that children and adolescents are still developing emotionally, psychologically, and socially. As a result, sentencing options available under juvenile law are often significantly more limited than those available in adult courts. In the case of Westside Middle School, those legal limitations became immediately apparent. During the legal proceedings, both Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson were found responsible for 5 counts of murder and 10 counts of aggravated assault. These charges reflected the deaths of Shannon Dawn Wright, Natalie Brooks, Paige and Herring, Stephanie Johnson, and Brittany Varner, along with the injuries sustained by 9 students and 1 teacher during the attack. The findings established legal responsibility for one of the deadliest school shootings in the United States at that time. Yet despite the severity of the offenses, the sentences available under Arkansas juvenile law remained limited. Under the statutes in effect in 1998, the maximum period of confinement for juvenile offenders in circumstances such as these extended only until they reached 21 years of age. This meant that neither Andrew nor Mitchell could receive life imprisonment or decades-long adult sentences regardless of the number of victims or the level of planning demonstrated by the evidence. Once this legal reality became widely known, intense public debate followed. Many families of the victims struggled to reconcile the magnitude of their losses with the limits imposed by juvenile law. Parents who had lost children faced the knowledge that the individuals responsible would eventually be released after reaching the legal age established by the juvenile system. For those families, no sentence could restore what had been taken from them. Nevertheless, the prospect of release while the victims would never return became one of the most emotionally painful aspects of the legal process. Their grief was accompanied by frustration that existing laws did not permit harsher penalties. Despite the seriousness of the crimes, the controversy surrounding the case extended beyond Arkansas. National media closely followed the proceedings, and discussions about juvenile justice intensified across the country. Legal scholars, policymakers, and members of the public debated fundamental questions that continue to arise whenever serious crimes are committed by children. Should age remain the primary factor determining punishment when offenses involve multiple deaths? To what extent should the legal system emphasize rehabilitation for offenders who commit acts of extraordinary violence during childhood? Can accountability and the possibility of rehabilitation coexist in cases involving such devastating consequences? The West Side case did not provide simple answers to these questions, but it became one of the most influential examples cited in subsequent discussions about juvenile justice reform. Throughout the proceedings, however, the court remained bound by the law as it existed at the time of the offense. Judges cannot impose penalties beyond those authorized by statute, regardless of public opinion or media attention. This distinction is an essential principle of the legal system. Courts apply existing law rather than creating new punishments after crimes have already occurred. Consequently, although emotions surrounding the case were understandably intense, the legal outcome reflected the statutory framework governing juvenile offenders in Arkansas during 1998 rather than the widespread calls for more severe punishment expressed by many observers. While the legal process unfolded, investigators also continued examining possible motives behind the attack. Although substantial evidence established how the shooting had been planned, determining why remained considerably more difficult. Authorities explored several possible explanations without identifying one definitive cause. Among the possibilities considered were personal conflicts involving classmates, a desire for attention, fascination with firearms, and the influence of earlier highly publicized school shootings. Some observers suggested that Mitchell Johnson's reported interpersonal difficulties at school may have contributed to the attack. Others focused on the boys' shared interest in hunting and firearms. Researchers examining broader patterns of school violence discussed whether extensive media coverage of previous shootings may have influenced vulnerable adolescents, an idea often described as the copycat effect. Yet despite these discussions, investigators consistently acknowledged that no single motive fully explained the planning and execution of the attack. The available evidence supported several contributing factors, but did not establish one comprehensive answer. This uncertainty distinguished the West Side case from many criminal investigations in which clear motives emerged through documented grievances or explicit statements by offenders. Here, Physical evidence successfully reconstructed the sequence of preparation while leaving the deeper psychological reasons unresolved. The inability to identify one definitive motive frustrated many observers. But it also reflected the complexity of human behavior. Serious acts of violence rarely result from one isolated circumstance. Instead, they often involve numerous interacting influences, some visible and others impossible to measure with certainty. By remaining cautious in their conclusions, investigators preserved the distinction between evidence and speculation, even when public pressure demanded more definitive explanations. As the legal proceedings concluded, the immediate judicial phase of the case came to an end, but its broader consequences were only beginning to unfold. Families continued grieving. Survivors faced lengthy physical and emotional recovery. Schools throughout the United States examined emergency procedures with renewed urgency. Law enforcement agencies, educators, and policymakers studied the events at Westside Middle School in an effort to reduce the likelihood of similar attacks in the future. At the same time, attention gradually turned toward what would happen after the juvenile sentences eventually expired. Under Arkansas law, both Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson would one day be released from custody. That prospect remained deeply controversial from the moment the sentences were imposed. It raised difficult questions not only about justice, but also about reintegration, public safety, and whether individuals responsible for such extraordinary crimes during childhood could ever live anonymously within society again. Those questions would continue long after the courtroom proceedings ended, shaping the next chapter of the Westside Middle School story and ensuring that the legacy of March 24, 1998, extended far beyond the verdict itself. When the legal proceedings concluded, the Westside Middle School case entered a new and deeply complicated chapter. Court hearings, verdicts, and sentencing had established legal responsibility under Arkansas juvenile law. But they could not bring closure to the families who had lost loved ones or erase the trauma experienced by survivors. For the community surrounding Jonesboro, the consequences of March 24, 1998, did not end when the courtroom doors closed. Instead, the effects continued to unfold over the following years as victims' families attempted to rebuild their lives. Injured students recovered from physical wounds, and an entire nation continued debating how to prevent similar tragedies from happening again. One of the most controversial aspects of the aftermath centered on the future of the two perpetrators. Under the juvenile justice system in place at the time of the offense, both Andrew Douglas Golden and Mitchell Scott Johnson remained in state custody only until they reached the maximum age permitted by law. From the moment those legal limits became widely understood, many members of the public questioned whether the sentences reflected the seriousness of the crime. Families of the victims had already endured the loss of children and a beloved teacher. Now they faced the certainty that the individuals responsible would eventually leave juvenile custody because the law provided no mechanism for longer confinement in this case. That reality remained painful regardless of differing opinions about juvenile justice. Andrew Golden was released after reaching the legal age established by Arkansas law. Following his release, he changed his name to Drew Grant in an effort to live outside the intense public attention that continued to surround the case. Despite the change of identity, complete anonymity proved difficult because the Jonesboro shooting remained one of the most widely discussed school shootings of the 1990s. Years later, in 2008, Andrew died in a traffic accident in Texas at the age of 21. His death brought one chapter of the story to an unexpected end, though it did not resolve the questions that had surrounded his actions since 1998. For many observers, the news generated mixed reactions. Some viewed it simply as another tragic event. Others reflected once again on the enormous contrast between the brief span of Andrew's life and the permanent consequences of decisions made when he was 11 years old. Mitchell Johnson was also released from juvenile custody after reaching the legal age permitted under state law. Unlike Andrew, however, Mitchell's name continued appearing in news reports during the years that followed. According to the available information, he later encountered additional legal problems involving drug-related offenses and violations of conditions connected to his supervision after release. These later incidents received media attention largely because of his connection to the West Side Middle School shooting rather than because they approached the scale of the original crime. Nevertheless, they reinforced public awareness that the case continued to influence discussions long after the original sentences had ended. The differing paths followed by Andrew and Mitchell after release illustrated another difficult reality confronting the juvenile justice system. Rehabilitation is one of the central objectives of juvenile courts. Yet measuring rehabilitation is far from straightforward. Some individuals successfully reintegrate into society after serving juvenile sentences, while others continue experiencing legal or personal difficulties. The West Side case did not produce simple conclusions regarding the effectiveness of rehabilitation, because the two perpetrators experienced different outcomes after leaving custody. What remained constant, however, was the enduring impact on those whose lives had been permanently altered by the shooting itself. For the families of the victims, time did not erase absence. Shannon Dawn Wright remained remembered as the teacher who attempted to protect students during the attack. Natalie Brooks, Paige and Herring, Stephanie Johnson, and Brithany Varner remained children whose futures ended before adolescence had truly begun. Every birthday not celebrated, every graduation never attended, and every milestone never reached became silent reminders of what had been lost. Public attention gradually shifted toward other national events over the years. But for those families, the consequences of March 24th remained part of everyday life. Survivors also carried lasting burdens beyond the injuries documented in medical records. The official count recorded 9 wounded students and 1 wounded teacher. Yet the emotional effects reached far beyond physical injuries. Students who escaped without being shot nevertheless witnessed scenes of fear and violence within a place they had always associated with learning and safety. Teachers returned to classrooms carrying memories of an event that fundamentally changed their understanding of school security. Parents throughout the community faced the challenge of helping children regain confidence in an environment that had once seemed unquestionably safe. The broader educational community also drew important lessons from the attack. One of the most significant involved emergency planning. Investigators had established that the perpetrators intentionally exploited a routine fire evacuation by activating the alarm and waiting outside in a concealed position. This realization prompted schools across the United States to examine whether traditional evacuation procedures sufficiently accounted for the possibility of an external armed threat. While fire safety remained essential, educators increasingly recognized that emergency planning would need to address a wider range of scenarios than had previously been considered. School administrators, law enforcement agencies, and emergency planners began reviewing procedures to reduce vulnerabilities revealed by the West Side attack. Another major consequence involved growing attention to identifying students who might be at risk of engaging in serious violence. The tragedy encouraged expanded discussions about behavioral warning signs, communication between schools and families, and early intervention strategies. At the same time, experts repeatedly emphasized an important caution. Most young people who display behavioral problems or experience emotional difficulties never commit acts of extreme violence. Effective prevention, therefore, requires careful assessment rather than assumptions based solely on isolated behaviors. The challenge lies in recognizing genuine risks without unfairly stigmatizing children who need support rather than suspicion. National conversations about firearm access also intensified following the shooting, because investigators determined that firearms had been taken from family members before the attack. Questions regarding secure firearm storage became increasingly prominent. Although opinions differed regarding broader firearm policy, the case underscored the importance of preventing unauthorized access by children. discussions concerning safe storage practices became part of the wider effort to understand how the tragedy had become possible. The West Side Middle School shooting also occupied an important place within the broader history of school violence in the United States, occurring after other highly publicized school shootings during the late 1990s. It contributed to growing concern that educational institutions faced new forms of risk. Researchers studying patterns of youth violence examined the case alongside earlier incidents and later tragedies, exploring questions surrounding media influence, adolescent development, access to firearms, and the phenomenon sometimes described as copycat violence. While investigators never established one definitive motive in the West Side case, scholars continued using it as an important example when examining how multiple factors can intersect in acts of juvenile violence. Only 1 year after Jonesboro, the Columbine High School shooting in 1999 would once again transform national discussions about school safety, further reinforcing the significance of lessons first highlighted by West Side. Yet despite subsequent tragedies, the events of March 24, 1998, retained their unique place in American criminal history because of the extraordinary youth of the perpetrators and the carefully planned use of a false fire alarm to initiate the ambush. Decades later, the case continues to be studied not because it offers easy answers, but because it demonstrates how difficult those answers can be to find. The evidence clearly established what happened and how it was accomplished. It identified the weapons, reconstructed the planning, documented the victims, and explained the legal outcome. What it never fully resolved was the deeper question that emerged almost immediately after the first headlines appeared. Why two boys, only 11 and 13 years old, chose to transform their own school into the scene of unimaginable violence? That unanswered question remains one of the defining legacies of the West Side Middle School shooting and serves as the foundation for the final reflections on what this tragedy continues to teach about schools, communities, and the enduring human cost of violence. The West Side Middle School shooting remains one of the most disturbing cases in the history of American school violence, not only because of the number of lives lost, but because of the age of those responsible. When the details of the attack became known, many people struggled to understand how two children could organize and carry out such a deliberate act of violence. The events of March 24, 1998, forced communities across the United States to confront uncomfortable questions about childhood, responsibility, access to firearms, school safety, and the ability to recognize warning signs before tragedy occurs. More than 2 decades later, the case continues to be remembered not simply as a crime committed by 2 young offenders, but as a tragedy defined by the lives of those who were lost and the lasting impact on everyone who survived. At the center of any discussion about West Side Middle School must remain the victims. The shooting was not only a story about Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson. It was first and foremost a tragedy experienced by students, teachers, families, and an entire community. Shannon Dawn Wright was 32 years old, an educator whose role was to teach and protect students. When the shooting began, she was not simply an individual caught in a violent event. She represented the many teachers who instinctively placed the safety of children above their own. The 4 students who died that day, Natalie Brooks, Paige and Herring, Stephanie Johnson, and Brithany Varner, were children who entered school expecting an ordinary day. They were not participants in a conflict. They were not prepared for danger. They were students following instructions during what they believed was a routine emergency: evacuation. Remembering the victims is essential because tragedies involving mass violence are often discussed through the actions of perpetrators. But the true measure of their impact is found in the people whose futures were taken away. Each victim represented a life that would have continued beyond that afternoon. Families lost daughters. A school lost members of its community. Friends lost classmates whose presence had been part of their daily lives. The numbers associated with the attack, 5 killed and 10 injured, provide a factual summary, but they cannot fully represent the personal losses experienced by those closest to the victims. The wounded survivors also carried consequences that extended beyond the immediate medical response. Physical injuries could be treated, but the emotional impact of witnessing violence at school created challenges that were far more difficult to measure. A school building, which should represent safety, learning, and opportunity, had become associated with fear and loss. Students who survived had to return to classrooms knowing that the environment they once considered familiar had changed forever. Teachers and staff members faced the difficult responsibility of continuing education while also processing their own experiences. For many survivors, the shooting became a defining moment in their lives, an event that divided their memories into the time before and after March 24, 1998. Beyond the personal experiences of survivors, the case produced major changes in how schools across the country approach security and emergency planning. Before Jonesboro, many school emergency procedures focused primarily on traditional dangers such as fires, natural disasters, or accidents. The West Side attack demonstrated that emergency systems could potentially be exploited by individuals intending to cause harm. The use of a false fire alarm was particularly significant because it challenged assumptions about evacuation procedures. Schools had long taught students to leave buildings immediately when alarms sounded. That response was correct and necessary for genuine emergencies. However, the attack revealed the need to consider additional risks during evacuations, including threats originating outside school buildings. As a result, educators and safety officials increasingly examined how schools could respond to a wider variety of emergency situations. This did not mean abandoning traditional safety procedures. Instead, it encouraged broader planning and cooperation between schools, law enforcement agencies, and emergency responders. The goal became creating systems capable of protecting students under different circumstances while maintaining the fundamental mission of education. The tragedy also contributed to national discussions about identifying students who may represent a risk to themselves or others. In the aftermath of Jonesboro and other school shootings of the late 1990s, schools began paying greater attention to warning signs, threats, aggressive behavior, and communication between students, families, and school officials. However, the case also highlighted the complexity of prevention. There is no single behavior that can reliably predict future violence. Many young people experience anger, conflict, or emotional struggles without ever committing serious crimes. Effective prevention requires careful evaluation, support systems, and attention to genuine indicators of danger rather than simply labeling troubled students as potential threats. Another lasting issue raised by the West Side case involved juvenile responsibility. The fact that Andrew Golden was 11 and Mitchell Johnson was 13 became one of the most discussed aspects of the tragedy. Their ages challenged traditional ideas about criminal responsibility. Society often views children as individuals still learning, developing, and changing. The case forced difficult questions about what happens when children commit crimes usually associated with adults. Should age limit punishment when the consequences of the crime are permanent? Should rehabilitation remain the primary goal, even in cases involving multiple deaths? These questions did not end with the West Side case. They continue to influence debates about juvenile justice throughout the United States. The legal outcome reflected the laws that existed in Arkansas at the time, but public disagreement over the sentences demonstrated the emotional difficulty of balancing accountability and the possibility of change. The case also became part of a larger conversation about media influence and the possibility of copycat violence. Because Jonesboro occurred during a period when the nation was already concerned about a series of school shootings, researchers examined whether previous incidents may have influenced later offenders. The idea that highly publicized acts of violence could inspire imitation became an important area of study. However, investigators never established a simple explanation that previous crimes directly caused the West Side attack. Instead, the case contributed to broader discussions about how society reports violence and how public attention may affect vulnerable individuals. The term copycat has sometimes been associated with the Jonesboro shooting in public discussions, but the case itself was not a copy of a later event such as the Beltway sniper attacks, which occurred years afterward. The tragedy occurred in 1998 and became part of the broader study of youth violence and possible imitation effects. Another reason the case remains significant is the way it demonstrated the difference between understanding an event and explaining it. Investigators were able to reconstruct the mechanics of the crime with considerable detail. They identified the weapons, the preparation, the location, the false alarm, and the sequence of events leading to the shooting. Yet the deeper question of motivation remained far more difficult. Human behavior cannot always be reduced to one cause. The available evidence suggested several contributing factors, including personal struggles, fascination with firearms, shared interests between the two boys, and possible influence from previous violent incidents. However, no single explanation fully accounted for why the plan was created or why it was carried out. This uncertainty is one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. People naturally seek clear answers after tragedy. They want to identify the moment when everything changed, the warning sign that was missed, or the single reason that explains unimaginable actions. But the West Side investigation demonstrated that reality is often more complicated. Multiple influences can interact over time, creating outcomes that are difficult to predict and even harder to understand. The legacy of the West Side Middle School shooting is therefore not only found in the tragedy itself, but also in the questions it continues to raise. It remains a reminder of the importance of protecting students, supporting young people facing difficulties, securing dangerous tools from unauthorized access, and taking threats seriously without assuming that every troubled child will become violent. Most importantly, it remains a reminder that behind every statistic are individual lives. The story of West Side Middle School is ultimately the story of 5 people who never had the chance to grow older, of survivors who carried memories of that day, and of a community forced to rebuild after an unimaginable loss. The final lesson of March 24, 1998, is not about the perpetrators who created the tragedy. It is about the responsibility of society to remember the victims, learn from the failures revealed by the event, and continue working toward preventing similar losses in the future. The passage of time has changed many things since March 24, 1998, but it has not erased the significance of what happened at West Side Middle School. The names of the victims, the details of the investigation, and the difficult questions raised by the case continue to remain part of the broader history of school violence in the United States. Although years have passed, the tragedy in Jonesboro remains a powerful reminder of how quickly ordinary moments can become irreversible and how deeply a single act of violence can affect generations of people. The story of West Side Middle School is not only a record of a crime, it is also a reflection on loss, responsibility, prevention, and the continuing effort to understand why such a tragedy occurred. On the afternoon of March 24, 1998, the students and teachers of West Side Middle School believed they were responding to a familiar emergency. The fire alarm was a sound they had heard before. It represented a procedure they had practiced many times. Students were expected to leave classrooms, follow their teachers, and move to designated areas outside the building. That routine existed because schools are built around the idea that preparation can protect lives. Yet on that day, the procedure was manipulated by 2 students who used it as part of a planned attack. The tragedy demonstrated one of the most painful realities of violence. Systems created for safety can be exploited when individuals intentionally seek to cause harm. The attack lasted only a short period of time, but the consequences continued long after the shooting stopped. For the families of Shannon Dawn Wright, Natalie Brooks, Paige and Herring, Stephanie Johnson, and Brittany Varner, March 24th became a permanent marker in their lives. The future moments they expected to share with their loved ones would never happen. Birthdays, graduations, personal achievements, and everyday conversations that should have continued were replaced by memories of lives interrupted. Public discussions about the case often focused on the ages of the perpetrators, the weapons used, or the legal outcome. However, the center of the tragedy remained the people who were lost. Remembering the victims prevents the case from becoming only another entry in a list of violent incidents. They were individuals with families, friendships, and futures that mattered. The survivors of the attack also carried the weight of that day. Some survived physical injuries, while others carried memories of fear and confusion that could not be seen. Experiencing violence in a school environment changed the way many people viewed a place that had previously represented security and education. Returning to classrooms after such an event required more than rebuilding physical spaces. It required rebuilding trust and a sense of safety. For teachers and students, the school was no longer simply a location where learning occurred. It had also become the place where they experienced one of the most traumatic events of their lives. In the years following the shooting, Westside became part of a national conversation about school security. The tragedy occurred during a period when Americans were increasingly concerned about violence in educational settings. The events in Jonesboro, along with other school shootings of the era, contributed to a shift in how schools approach safety. Administrators began examining emergency plans, communication systems, and cooperation with law enforcement. The goal was not simply to respond after violence occurred, but to identify ways to reduce risks before tragedies developed. One of the most important lessons from the West Side case involved the need to recognize that school safety requires preparation for multiple types of emergencies. Traditional procedures remained essential, but the attack demonstrated that schools needed to consider threats beyond those traditionally expected. Emergency planning became more complex, requiring balance between maintaining an open educational environment and preparing for rare but devastating possibilities. Another lasting discussion created by the case involved the relationship between childhood and criminal responsibility. The fact that Andrew Golden was 11 and Mitchell Johnson was 13 at the time of the attack remains one of the most striking aspects of the case. Their ages challenged assumptions about what children are capable of doing and how society should respond when children commit acts of extreme violence. The juvenile justice system is built on the belief that young offenders may change and that rehabilitation is possible. However, the West Side case forced many people to confront the emotional difficulty of applying that principle to crimes involving multiple deaths. The legal outcome reflected the laws that existed at the time, but the debate surrounding the sentences revealed a deeper conflict between punishment, accountability, and the possibility of rehabilitation. This conflict remains unresolved in many discussions about juvenile justice today. The case also contributed to research into the possible influence of previous acts of violence. Because the West Side shooting occurred during a period of increasing attention towards school shootings, researchers examined whether young offenders could be influenced by earlier highly publicized attacks. The idea of copycat violence became an important subject of study. However, the circumstances surrounding Jonesboro remained complex. While investigators considered possible influences from previous incidents, they did not identify a single source that explained the attack. The case demonstrated that violent acts usually emerge from a combination of factors rather than one simple cause. Understanding that complexity is important because oversimplified explanations can prevent society from recognizing the broader issues involved. The investigation into West Side provided clear answers about what happened. Authorities determined how the weapons were obtained, how the attackers prepared, how the fire alarm was used, how the shooting unfolded, and how the suspects were captured. Yet the investigation could not provide a complete answer to the most difficult question: why? That unanswered question remains one of the most haunting elements of the case. People naturally search for a clear explanation after tragedy. They want to know what created the decision to harm others, what warning signs existed, and whether the outcome could have been prevented. But human behavior is complicated, and even extensive investigations sometimes reveal only part of the truth. The West Side case serves as a reminder that prevention requires looking beyond individual moments and examining the broader environments in which young people develop. It requires attention to emotional struggles, communication between families and schools, responsible firearm access, and the willingness to take concerning behavior seriously while still recognizing that most troubled young people are not violent. The story of Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson has remained widely discussed because it represents an extreme example of juvenile violence, yet focusing only on the perpetrator's risks, overlooking the greater meaning of the tragedy. The lasting importance of West Side Middle School comes from the lessons learned, the lives remembered, and the ongoing responsibility to protect students. The case changed how many Americans thought about school safety and juvenile crime. But its most important legacy remains human rather than institutional. It is found in the memory of those who died, the courage of those who responded, and the resilience of those who continued living after the attack. More than 2 decades later, West Side Middle School stands as a reminder of the devastating consequences that can follow when warning signs are missed and violence reaches a place meant for learning and growth. It also stands as a reminder that every discussion about preventing future tragedies must begin with compassion for those who were harmed. The story is not ultimately defined by the weapons, the investigation, or the legal debate. It is defined by the people whose lives were changed forever on a spring afternoon in Arkansas. Their memories remain the reason the case continues to be studied, discussed, and remembered. The tragedy of March 24th, 1998 cannot be undone, but the lessons drawn from it continue to shape efforts to create safer schools and protect future generations.